This program is a presentation of UCTV for educational and non-commercial use only.
Where are the world's most endangered forest? Most of you would say something like the Amazon, the lungs of the world, or maybe something like redwood forests of California. But you wouldn't even be close. Hello, my name is Tom Gillespie, and I'm going to try to get you interested in the world's most endangered forest. The world's most endangered forests occur in biodiversity hotspots. These are regions around the world that have exceptionally high levels of diversity and endemism and are under an exceptional degree of threat due to humans. There are about 25 biodiversity hotspots around the world, and most of them occur in the tropics. Some places like the coastal forest of Brazil have been reduced to less than 20% of their historic range. If you go to the Caribbean, there's some forest types that have been reduced to less than 5% of their historic range. But if you go to the Pacific or Oceania, there's some forest types that have been reduced to less than 1% of their historic range. So let's do this. Over the next half hour, let's examine the natural history and culture of Oceania and try to identify the world's most endangered forests.
The Hawaiian Islands are the world's most isolated archipelago. 5 million years ago, present-day Hawaii erupted from the Pacific Ocean and looked like this: bare lava, bare rock. One plant was able to colonize Hawaii every 20,000 years. And over millions of years, this resulted: the native vegetation and forests that we see today. One of the plants that made it to Hawaii was hibiscus, which is the quintessential symbol of Hawaiian shirts. The plant is in the cotton family, and as you can imagine, it floated to Hawaii, established itself, and evolved into a new species. This pincushion-like plant is the Hawaiian silversword. It's in the sunflower family. This plant was originally a simple sunflower that dispersed from California to Hawaii and evolved into 30 species. When it's time to bloom, it spends all of its energy to send up a 6-foot stalk with a beautiful array of sunflowers. Then it dies. A number of birds were able to disperse to Hawaii as well, like this one, the Hawaiian nene. This was a Canadian goose that accidentally got caught in a storm and dispersed to Hawaii, where it stayed and evolved into a new species. Today, 76% of the endemic birds are now endangered or extinct. Their demise began with the arrival of the Polynesians, who colonized Hawaii 800 years ago from the South Pacific. Feathers were highly valued by Polynesians and were used to make cloaks for Hawaiian chiefs. This cloak contains over 80,000 bird feathers. Captain Cook was the first haole, or outsider, to come to the islands in 1778. He named them the Sandwich Islands. He brought with him a team of scientists who surveyed the plants of Hawaii. Unfortunately, on his second voyage to Hawaii, Cook was killed trying to kidnap a chief. But the locals were nice enough to return some of his body parts to his crew. Captain Cook is still honored to this day with the Union Jack and the Hawaiian state flag. As you know, the Hawaiian Islands are the 50th state, established in 1959. This is what most people imagine or remember when they think of Hawaii. Great weather, nice hotels, warm water, and of course, surfing. Hawaiians invented surfing during the Middle Ages, using wooden planks made from native trees, such as koa and wili wili. Royalty-sponsored surfing clubs that would compete to show their prowess at Hehe Nalu, or wave slide. While just about everyone knows about surfing and Hawaii's beautiful setting, what most people do not realize is that Hawaii contains some of the world's most degraded ecosystems. In fact, the dry lowlands of Hawaii contain almost 100% exotic species. Diamond Head, one of the most memorable symbols of Hawaii, once contained native forest called tropical dry forest, which has all but disappeared in the lowlands. If you want to find native tropical dry forest, you have to go to isolated areas on steep slopes that are protected from fire. This is one of the largest and best preserved dry forests in Hawaii. It occurs on a military base on the island of Oahu. This fragment, which is about the size of a football field, contains a diversity of native trees and shrubs. The canopy is relatively short, and light is able to pass through to the understory. Here we have a classic example of healthy tropical dry forest that is dominated by native species. The forest is made up of relatively small trees. Imagine when the first Polynesians arrived in Hawaii, this is exactly what they saw. Today, it takes an army of people to remove exotics and protect the forest from fire. And unfortunately, there is no comparative data on how many fragments exist or the number of endangered species that occur in remaining dry forests of Hawaii. So how do you survey what remains? One way to do this is to follow this man, Gentry. He's the greatest field botanist of the 20th century. He developed a field method that has been widely used to study the distribution of plants in the tropics. It is called Gentry transects. A Gentry transect is a belt, or transect, 2 meters wide and 50 meters long. When you lay 10 of these transects 10 meters apart through a forest, you get a really good idea of the species composition and structure. The hardest part is actually finding the fragments and laying the 50-meter transects. Here we have Stephanie Powell, who studies tropical dry forests of Hawaii. Once she lays the transect, she identifies every tree larger than a quarter at chest height. When you do this in 25 of the largest and best remaining fragments, you get a good idea of the current floristic composition and structure of these forests. So let's take a look at a couple of these sites. This is one of the best protected dry forest fragments on the island of Molokai. It is surrounded by a pine plantation. Most of the remaining fragments of dry forest in Hawaii are fenced in to keep out introduced mammals. The only native mammal to the Hawaiian Islands was a fruit bat, but the Polynesians brought pigs and goats, and the Europeans brought deer and cattle. These introduced animals love to eat native vegetation, because in their isolation, most of these plants have lost their chemical defenses. Inside this fence, we have a species of koa that was once widespread on the dry side of Molokai. Native Hawaiians used it to make surfboards. We also have a very rare sunflower that only occurs at this one site. Even with the fence, this fragment is still vulnerable to fire, and a fire ripped through here in 2005, killing 80% of the native trees. Instead of a pine plantation, why not a native koa plantation? I mean, after all, the native Hawaiians did use them to make surfboards. Here we have one of the most diverse fragments on the island of Maui. Although it does not look like much, this small fragment contains 6 different native species. The lowlands of Maui also contain wili-wili forest that are able to grow in the dry lowlands. Like many tropical dry forest trees around the world, wili-wili loses its leaves during the dry season and photosynthesizes through the bark. Most of the trees in this genus around the world have spines, but this wili-wili has lost its spines, another example of a native Hawaiian plant that has lost its defenses. Here we have a beautiful wili-wili flower. This flower is zygomorphic, which means native insects enter in search of nectar, and hitting the center, the male part of the plant deposits pollen on the insect's back. But in 2005, an African wasp was introduced to Hawaii and started eating all the seeds. On the island of Lanai, there are 2 fenced enclosures that protect tropical dry forest. This forest only contains 2 common species, because the rest have gone locally extinct. This is a beautiful fence around the second site in Lanai, and the survival of these fragments depends on these fences. However, fences are expensive to maintain, and even the Nature Conservancy has abandoned a number of these fragments. So how do you know what these forests look like before the arrival of the Polynesians and Europeans? The only scientific way to figure out what the original dry forests of Hawaii look like is to take sediment cores of lakes and examine the fossil pollen found in the sediment. Pollen from surrounding plants has blown into this lake for thousands of years and sunk to the bottom where it's covered up by mud and sand.
So this has got the same depth exactly, Stephanie, to hit that 35, 36 centimeters.
Using a coring device, you can extract 2,000 to 3,000 years of sediment. This sediment core goes back 2,000 years.
Be cool to see some Willy Willy in here. We'll see.
When you bring it back to the lab, you cut the core into 1 centimeter sections and add extremely dangerous chemicals to get rid of the dirt, sand, and oils. Once you're done, you have pollen slides from different time periods. By counting the pollen grains, you can identify what forests were like before the arrival of the Polynesians. From this pollen, we can tell what the forest looked like at this site. It looked like this. There used to be wide expanses of Willy Willy on the dry side. There are a number of species in the only native palm genus in Hawaii, Pritchardia, most of which are on the endangered species list. There were also a number of hibiscus relatives that used to be common in dry forests, like this Hibiscus clayi, which is now restricted to 1 population with 4 plants. So the next time you're in Hawaii, I would like you to remember that almost every plant you see will be exotic, and it's only through sediment cores that we really know what historically existed.
Most of you have been to Hawaii or will visit Hawaii, but there's other places in the South Pacific that are just as interesting. How about the wonderful islands of Fiji?
Now, many people have heard of Fiji, but it's not one island. It's a group of 300 islands located in the South Pacific. Fiji was first colonized by Melanesians 3,500 years ago, much earlier than the Polynesians from New Guinea. They brought with them a number of traditions that continue to this day, like the kava ceremony. The British colonized Fiji in the 18th century, but most have left, and there's very little evidence of the British Empire in Fiji beyond the fact that there are a couple of colonial buildings and they drive on the wrong side of the road. The British did, however, leave rugby, which quickly took the place of fighting wars as the most popular sport in Fiji. The British also imported labor from southern India to work in the sugarcane fields. These people are referred to as IndoFijians because most have lived in Fiji for more than 3 generations. As the IndoFijians increased to almost 50% of the population, there's been some political unrest between these two cultures. However, if you ask the younger generation, it appears that they're working things out. Most people come to Fiji to see their spectacular coral reefs, but Fiji also has incredible terrestrial diversity, like mangrove forests, which are forests that occur in shallow waters and river mouths throughout the tropics. Many mangrove species have a complex structure of stilted roots that firmly attach the tree into the soft mud or sand. Mangroves begin their lives as a flower, which are pollinated by wind and insects, or they can even self-pollinate. Once pollinated, the mangrove begins to germinate on the parent plant. Although this looks like a seed, it's actually a long root. When they fall, these roots can float for months in the salt water until the heavier end sticks into the sand or mud and they establish themselves. One of the nice things about mangrove forests is they are easy to restore. Carefully plant them in a systematic fashion, and the mangroves practically restore themselves. Here we have a black and white aerial photograph that shows the extent of mangrove forests.
Today, we use near real-time satellite imagery to calculate the extent of forests. These satellites can also collect data on wavelengths the human eye cannot see, such as the infrared wavelength, which is excellent for studying vegetation. For instance, as we pull out here, you can see cloud forests on extinct volcanoes, the outlines of coral reefs, which show the extent of islands during the Ice Age, and the extent of agriculture on the dry side of Fiji, which is not covered by clouds. Now let's say you want to find the best remaining fragments of tropical dry forest in Fiji, a place where you've never been. How do you know where to go if there's hundreds of islands?
To do this, we use satellite imagery and elevation data. As you zoom in here, you can see this island is covered by grass, and these two islands contain forest. When you get in the field, you find it looks very similar to the model you created using satellite data. Just like tropical dry forests around the world, these forests contain a number of deciduous species that lose their leaves during the dry season. Although tropical dry forest has been reduced to less than 1% of its range in Fiji, there are about 50 excellent fragments of dry forest in the Osawa group of islands. Like tropical dry forests of Hawaii, most of these forests occur on blocky lava and steep slopes, and contain a beautiful assortment of trees and shrubs. Dry forests of Fiji also contain lianas, or woody vines.
It's generally pretty rare that we find flowers in tropical forests. So here we have Passiflora. It's a very common liana here in tropical dry forests of Fiji.
However, even if you identify a rare plant, it is super difficult to get people excited about a plant. Are you excited? One thing that is exciting is the crested iguana, which is restricted to the tropical dry forests of Fiji. This ancient lineage of iguana was discovered by Western scientists only 30 years ago.
And what is even more incredible is that this iguana got stuck on a log in South America and floated across the Pacific until it got to and missed Tahiti and floated for at least another month till it landed in Fiji, where I'm sure it let out a huge exhale when it landed. Now, we usually think of Columbus as the world's greatest navigator, but if you really think about it, how could he have missed the New World? I'm much more impressed with the iguana's journey.
To protect this critically endangered species that is restricted to only 3 small islands, you need a team of people to examine its habitat, count the number of individuals that remain, and you need someone to protect them. Like Pita, who is known in Fiji as the ranger who is no stranger to danger. He protects the world's largest population of crested iguanas.
Do visit Fiji, it's a wonderful place. But if you want to go to the coolest place in the South Pacific, it would have to be New Caledonia.
New Caledonia was discovered by Captain Cook in 1774. He named it after Old Caledonia, or Scotland, because many areas of the island looked like the moors of Scotland. Native Kanaks, also Melanesians, colonized the area 3,500 years ago. The Kanaks are famous for their diversity of thatched huts. The top of the chief's hut is adorned with a flesh or arrow. The flesh honors the ancestral spirits, and each tribe has a distinct flesh. This flesh is one of the most distinct symbols of New Caledonia, which is why it's on the national flag of the Kanak people. Today, New Caledonia is a French territory, like Tahiti. But unlike Fiji, where all the British left, the French are still around to this day. This is the capital, Noumea, which is known as the Riviera of the South Pacific, and it contains all things French. All the signs are in French, they play pétanque, and even the trucks are slightly different. There has definitely been some tension between the Kanaks and the French, because up to World War II, the Kanaks lived under a system similar to apartheid. But today, the French actively support and promote the Kanak culture, and this results in a wonderful combination of Kanak and French culture. New Caledonia was only new to Captain Cook. You see, it is an ancient landmass that broke off of Australia 85 million years ago and saved ancient plants that have gone extinct elsewhere. One of these ancient plants is the tree Araucaria. Araucarias are known as living fossils because they were once widespread around the world during the time of the dinosaurs. 70% of the world's Araucarias occur only in New Caledonia. and nowhere else. New Caledonia also has an ancient ecosystem that occurs nowhere else in the world. It's called marquise scrub. Marquise scrub occurs on serpentine rock, which was created deep in the earth and pushed to the surface. Serpentine is used to make asbestos and is extremely poisonous to plants. However, over millions of years, marquise plants have adapted and now thrive on these poisonous soils, which exotic species are not able to colonize. One plant in the marquise scrub is proteas. Proteas are named after the Greek god Proteus, who was able to change forms at will. But I would like you to remember that the marquise scrub contains hundreds of lovely primitive plants found nowhere else in the world. New Caledonia also has more traditional vegetation types like tropical rainforests that can be found on almost every island in the Pacific. Tropical rainforests contain a diversity of tall trees, form a closed canopy where only 5% of the light reaches the forest floor. Another type of forest that is common in the tropics are cloud forests. Cloud forests occur on volcanoes and mountain ridges, and as the name implies, are generally covered by clouds. Cloud forests are more open than tropical rainforests because they are on steep slopes, and the trees are almost completely covered by epiphytes, or plants that live on other plants. However, the most endangered forest in New Caledonia is forêt sèche, or dry forest. This is Wintoro, the only decreed nature reserve with protected tropical dry forest in New Caledonia. On the left, you have a large patch of tropical dry forest, and on the right, you have a small patch that is being invaded by exotic species. Originally from South America, this plant produces thousands of fire-resistant seeds, and once established, nothing is able to outcompete it. Another threat to this forest is cattle and deer that were introduced by Europeans. These exotics graze down the landscape until there are barely any trees left. The only trees that remain are untasty exotics in the valleys. But if you look really closely, you can see one of the last remaining fragments of tropical dry forest on private land. This area has been fenced in by a private landowner, and without the fence, it would look like the rest of the landscape. But this small fragment contains a number of unique and endangered plants. There is very little soil here, which is why this forest can persist to this day, because you can't practice agriculture. This is an extremely endangered tree called Terminalia sheriri that is restricted to only 10 sites in New Caledonia. It's kind of hard to get excited by a tree that looks like this, but if you look very closely, it does have a beautiful reddish stem. One of my favorite plants is Croton insularis, a common plant in the South Pacific. If you look at the underside of the leaf, it's shiny and easy to identify. There is one tree that is really beautiful and very hard to find. It is Captain Cookie Eye in the coffee family. This genus occurs only in the tropical dry forests of New Caledonia. It grows to 4 meters tall and has a beautiful cluster of flowers along the stem.
So after examining results from 25 different biodiversity hotspots and looking at the extent of forest, levels of diversity, and levels of endemism, the results are this. The world's most endangered forest occurs right here in the United States of America. They're tropical dry forests of Hawaii. 90% of the plants in the dry forest are endemic and occur nowhere else in the world. Of these, 45% are on the federal endangered species list, and there's only 25 fragments that still need to be better protected. So let's do this. Let's bring these things back from the edge of extinction. Let's make them common again. All we have to do is identify what historically occurred on the dry side of Hawaii, replant rare species to get them off the endangered species list, and protect these remaining fragments by removing non-natives, building fences, and preventing forest fires. When this is done, the forest will come back. And if you really want to conserve these places, go visit them, because it's the best way for the average person to make a difference.